Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, the audience members from wherever you are around the world. Thank you very much for joining us for this, the last in our series of convenings on solutions for the global stocktake. The last but not the least in terms of importance, because we're addressing the critical issues of adaptation and loss and damage in the context of the global stocktake. My name is Kaveh Gülümpo. I'm the Vice President of International Strategies at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. And for over 2 years, we've been doing a deep dive project on what a successful global stocktake might look like and how we can move from incremental towards transformational levels of ambition and implementation. In that context of work and really looking at what success in the global stocktake might mean for the critical areas of adaptation and loss and damage, I'm really thrilled to be joined by an excellent panel of speakers from around the world. We have Marcia Toledo, who's the Director of Adaptation and Resilience at the Climate Champions team. We have Salim Huq, who needs no introduction, but he's the Director of International Center for Climate Change and Development. We have Debbie Lay, who's Chief of Energy and Natural Resources for the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. We have Christina Rumbaitis, who's Senior Advisor for Adaptation and Resilience at the UN Foundation. And we have Jingjing Gao, who's a researcher and advisor at the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. So truly a wonderful breadth of expertise and representation from around the world and different kinds of organization. Our panel will provide their thoughts and reflections on a few questions, including which of the solutions in the technical paper that CGS has produced on the global stocktake would they want to see highlighted in any GST or COP28 outcome, and why? What needs to be done between now and COP28 to take forward the cause of adaptation and loss and damage towards a good and effective outcome from the global stocktake? And also the question of what should 2024 look like, which is a critical year in the preparation of new ambition, including towards entities, but also for implementation of existing promises. So I wanted to alert you, the audience, that you have a couple of ways that you can interact with this webinar. First of all, please do post any questions that you have using the question and answer function somewhere at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If we have time, we will pose some of those questions to the panel. So please don't be shy and do come forward with those questions as they arise. We'll be very interested to see those. Just to let you know, you can actually vote on your favorite questions as they come in. So if you think one is particularly good, please give it a thumbs up and it will magically float towards the top of my screen. So we'll know that it's an important question. And the second thing that we'll do is we will launch a poll where audience members, unfortunately not panelists, can vote on their favorite solution that's in our C2S paper. And that's a paper I would be remiss to say that we produce in conjunction with both Transformer and also with EDF. So Philip, if you could please launch that poll, and audience members, please do interact with that throughout the webinar, and we'll try to give you the results towards the end. So before I turn to the panel, I'd like to introduce Juliana Arciniegas. She's a very dear friend of mine. I call her Yuli. I never say her full name, so I apologize for completely messing that up. But Yuli is a director of Transformer and has been working very closely with C2S over the last 18 months or so, particularly on the areas of adaptation and loss and damage. So Juliana, tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much, Kaveh, and hello to everyone. I'm very glad to see all of you connected here as we advance, hopefully, a common vision on adaptation and loss and damage for the GST, which I have to say has been very difficult. So let me start by presenting what has been the rationale behind of our project and the theory of change of it, to understand the paper that you may have read. Basically, and this next slide. So yes, and thanks for sharing it in the chat. So the theory of change of the project, we've been working together with C2S, EDF, and other consultants and organizations, is based on these 3 tiers. First, we believe that the GST, in order to provide an added value to the climate action, has to send a limited and a strategic number of clear signals or high level as to what parties, but also non-party stakeholders should do in the next years to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and avoid catastrophic climate change. Second, we have the high impact opportunities, or what we call solutions, and these include the identification of a specific set of actions that would support the implementation of those high-level signals, and that could speak directly to national level policymakers and non-party stakeholders in every country, and this definitely needs to be accompanied by the support and scale-up means of implementation. And then we have a third tier. You won't see that one in the paper, but it's the technical resources that may support implementation of those high-level signals and opportunities that I just referred to. So in considering the different signals and opportunities, I have to say that we took into consideration the conversations and the summaries of the GST technical dialogue process, the IPCC AR6 chapter on climate resilient development pathways, as well as wealth of work on pathways and agendas for 2030 and 2050 climate action, like the work of the high-level climate champions, the breakthrough agendas, the Marrakesh partnerships, and so many others. And also in considering and identifying these signals and solutions, we took into consideration a very specific criteria to select these options. So we took into consideration the certainty and the potential of their impact, their feasibility, the existing of relevant initiatives, because what we have seen is that there are many of these areas and projects and initiatives that already exist. The barriers also, why are we not being able to implement some of these ideas that we know for a long time, and the synergies and trade-offs in achieving the SDGs. So particularly for adaptation, and if we can go to the next slide, perhaps before presenting this list of the signals that you will find in the paper, just to mention that we consider the breadth of the applicability of these options, which is estimated by the degree to which each adaptation option can be applied across multiple contexts. And in this sense, we privilege the options that, according to the IPCC, can reduce the exposure or the vulnerability of most people in the world. Then in the second place, we consider the potential benefits of those adaptation options for ecosystems and ecosystem services. And third, we consider the potential contribution of adaptation options to what the IPCC calls successful adaptation, and that on the other side of the spectrum could be potential maladaptation. So all of these are aimed to be transformational potential actions for adaptation. In this slide, you will see I included not the complete names. You will find the complete names of these solutions with their specific targets and percentages in the paper, but they address basically the need for increasing global resilience, the importance of conservation and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems, the transformation of agriculture and food systems, the universalization of early warning systems and climate services, and the increase of capacity and resources of developing countries for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And then there were some other ideas and signals that were not included in here, but that have came across different conversations, for example, on transboundary risk, on non-economic losses and damages, and on the establishment of climate resilient universal health systems. You will see more details of these ones in the paper, the ones you're seeing in the slide. I have to say also that other elements that we believe will be critical for the GST outcome on adaptation and loss and damage relate to the implementation of the framework of the GGA, the quality of adaptation implementation processes and avoiding maladaptation and engaging in transformative action, the developing countries' commitments, the development countries' commitments to double the provision of adaptation finance by 2025 and accelerating the operationalization of the new fund for loss and damage. So these are other elements that we see important as part of this conversation, but that are not specific solutions or signals in our paper. And next, please, for the sake of time, I will just present 2 examples of prioritized signals and their associated opportunities on adaptation and loss and damage. So the first one on adaptation, this signal is related to a transformation of agriculture and food systems. And in this specific case, the signal is to a very large extent based on the global adaptation outcome targets for food security and agriculture systems contained in the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda that was issued by the COP27 presidency through the collaboration with the high-level champions, the Marrakesh Partnership, and a number of UN specialized agencies. And the solutions are based both on the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda and the 2022 Global Land Outlook report of the UNCCT. So here you see that the high-level ask or the signal is that by 2030, we should foster climate resilient, sustainable agriculture that increases yields and agroforestry by 17% and reduces farm-level greenhouse gas emissions by 21% without the expansion of the agriculture frontier, and halve the share of food production lost and per capita waste relative to 2019 levels. And then you will see like what are the ways or opportunities through which you can reach that high-level signal or implement it. Like what are those options, those real options that could speak to different stakeholders for the implementation of the signal. And then for loss and damage, I have to say it has been quite challenging to find, if we move to the next slide, please. So on loss and damage, I have to say it has been challenging to find a signal that is not strictly related to the ongoing work of the transitional committee, as most of the major gaps on loss and damage are related to capacity and resources available. But here, we believe it is important that the GST sends a signal on the importance of significantly increasing by 2030 the capacity and the resources of developing countries with a focus on those that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage, including at the local, national, regional, and international levels. And there you have the specific ways in which that can happen or be promoted by strengthening international cooperation and support, by increasing capacity and resources of developing countries, to make use of communication and reporting mechanisms existing under the convention, by integrating national adaptation planning processes with climate risk management. And I'm sure there may be many others that can support this high-level message. But I will leave it here, Kaveh, just to say that these are part of the signals that we believe are critical for 2 of the main components of the GST, as our adaptation and loss and damage. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Yuli. I appreciate that, and perfect timing as to be expected from you. I understand that I have a slightly unstable internet connection because I'm traveling, so apologies if people can't hear me clearly. If things get bad, I'm going to ask Juliana to take over the hosting, but hopefully people can hear me for now. So I'd like to turn first to Marcia. So Marcia, I think one of the things that we heard Juliana speaking about there was things like pathways and solutions going forward. And of course, she also referenced the work of the champions, and there's the increasing focus on adaptation and resilience in the work of the champions, including through the Race to Resilience, but particularly on this sort of question of pathways going forward beyond COP28, and also following up on some of the 2030 breakthroughs. I wonder if there's anything on that you'd like to say. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much, Kaveh. It's a pleasure to be here with you and the fellow panelists, and also the great audience we have today. Maybe I can start by first reflecting the urgency to put people at the center of climate action. So in that sense, it's very critical for us in adaptation and resilience discussions to reflect that a GST outcome should very much emphasize the need for putting people at the center of adaptation. In that sense, also making reference to climate justice and the local level action, locally led principles, or addressing the most vulnerable. So we have today, as per the IPCC, 3.3 to 3.6 billion people vulnerable to climate change. And the Race to Resilience campaign has a goal by 2030 to increase resilience to 4 billion by, with accelerating actions on the ground. But when we look at that, it's really all about how people are improving their capacities, the well-being, their conditions, and the co-creation, the ownership on those solutions that can be accelerating and reducing the vulnerability and thrive despite climate change. In that sense, I just want to start with that, because any other solutions that we will identify, which we are already identifying, are at the end, to be tested by that question: is it increasing the adaptation of whom and how? And that both questions are really important to be able to deliver. So I very much reflect and relate to the exercise of the paper in regards of the solutions. We did an exercise last year when we identified, and we did a similar process of what are those key tangible solutions that can help us bring convergence and avoid the very diluted space that exists in adaptation and resilience. There's so much to do, so many different initiatives and approaches, and how we can drive and accelerate action. We don't have time to waste. So in that perspective, we developed, based on the Markets Partnership Resilience Pathway and the many different bottom-up inputs from the fora of discussion on climate and water, or oceans and water, or urban and water. What are those tangible near-term solutions? And the Sharm el-Sheikh agenda was born and elevated at COP last year, but it's an agenda of solutions in process. I have a slide, maybe it would be great to also show it while I'm explaining it. And in that sense, this is an agenda of 30 outcomes that were identified last year, continue to be refined and improved. Of course, nothing is written in stone, but reflect the multi-level, let's say, opportunities and levers. The solution at the critical, clear, with a tangible, achievable target, but also how the solutions can have synchronicity and impact at a system level, and how it's critical to see as well adaptation and resilience being advanced and accelerated at an impact level, at a system level. And in that sense, connecting and advancing an agenda that can respond to the IPCC ARC synthesis report on resilient development and the different pathways to achieve to that. So mostly to say that key is the role of non-state actors and governments on an agenda of solutions. I personally cannot necessarily pick one solution out of these 30 solutions that are in this agenda. I would say perhaps there are 5 or 6 that are very, very important and requires a specific, star or highlighted. That is fine. It will be important to receive inputs on that. But my contributions to your discussion is people-centered solutions, impact at system level, but also how can we better increase the ambition loop and look into this year. The role of nature is important in the convergence of both conventions. How can we achieve and accelerate the role of nature also in the global stocktake, so that we can very strongly position the opportunity for people, the benefits for water security, food security, but also health. So in that sense, a few elements to be prioritized. Of course, the next slide showed a little bit more the type of solutions and which is the, let's say, work in progress to also elevate the role of health and the type of solutions that requires, which we are also very eager to receive inputs, but in the opportunity to reflect, we cannot wait and we have to move forward. The GST can showcase already the progress. And a part of that body of work on the Sharm el-Sheikh agenda is developing as well the forward-looking indicators this assessment framework, how we can showcase progress, the macro levels of signals of change that can help us say there is advancement, there are roles for non-state actors and governments to play. We can have impact at system level, but especially we need to do more, and how the role of planning and finance is critical for accelerating action. So thank you.
Hello, can people hear me? Sorry, I just had a real problem with my internet. Sincerely, apologies for that. I've just moved location. Marcia, thank you very much. I got 95% of what you were saying. So in particular, this focus on the need for people-centered climate action. I know you said that you couldn't pick a particular solution, but I do like the one example that you gave, which resonates very strongly with one of the solutions in our paper about achieving resilience for certain numbers of people, because I think it speaks very clearly at the political level, and it's a very simple one to understand. And with Christina at UN Foundation, we've just produced a paper on what high-level political signals at COP28 could look like. So that one was interesting. But I think you said the importance of non-parties and parties, but also that the need to have a people-centered approach, but that has impact. And you highlighted also the importance this year in particular of nature, given the sort of where we are in the cycle under both the conventions. So apologies for that slight interruption, but hopefully I got all of your main points there. I'd like now to turn to Salim. Again, as I say, Salim is not someone who needs an introduction, but Salim, the perennial issue that we have here is that there's a lot of ambition that countries, particularly developing and in particular vulnerable developing countries, want to put into addressing adaptation, achieving resilience, but also minimizing, averting, and addressing loss and damage. But of course, means of implementation and support is a key aspect of that. Perhaps you'd like to come in on that. You have the floor. Thanks, Salim.
Great. Thank you very much, Kaveh, and hello to everybody. So let me start by mentioning the big picture, the elephant in the room, as it were. In the last few days, on the 3rd of July, 2023, we had the hottest day in the whole world ever. Then the second day after that, the 4th of July, we broke that record and we had a new hottest day. And then on the 6th of July, we broke that record again, with the hottest day being 3 hottest days in the last week. The last week was the hottest week the world has ever seen. And this is just a beginning, all right? We are just getting started. The El Nino has started in the Pacific, and the next year and the next few years are going to be particularly bad El Nino years, and nobody is ready for this in the world, all right? So that's just to illustrate the scale of the problem, which now is at the magnitude of the COVID virus plus Ukraine-Russia war rolled into one, and bigger than that. And we're not ready. And so we really do need to up our game going forward and make these processes much more fit for purpose than they have been so far. And I will argue that we now need to look at the problem from a completely different perspective than we have before, which is that losses and damages from the impacts of human-induced climate change are now a reality. We have entered the era of losses and damages. And therefore, everything else is how do we avert and how do we minimize those losses and damages, and then how do we deal with them? Because we're going to have to deal with them. Even rich countries are going to have to deal with them. There's no escaping them. And so in that context, the issue of adaptation and loss and damage rears its head as, in my view, the #1 priority that we need to be focusing on in the GST, in the Global Goal on Adaptation, in COP28 and in COP29. And we need to raise the level of political will to resource that at the level that it requires. We had a very good effort just a few days ago in Paris, which I had the good fortune to attend, led by President Macron, to try to reorganize global finances, because the old $100 billion a year is just trivial amount now. We're talking trillions. We're going to need trillions. We're going to have to redirect trillions of investments that are going into the wrong places and move them into the right places. And the 100 billion is no longer even an issue that is relevant anymore. It's just an issue of trust and delivering on promises or not delivering on promises. And so my view on the GST is, how do we make it something that raises that level of ambition and urgency at the level of urgency that is required? And the final point I'll make is, again, to reiterate what Marcia said about it being in my view, primarily a bottom-up process rather than a top-down process. The top-down process has failed us, all right? We're not giving up on it, but it has failed, absolutely failed. We need to recognize that and reform it. And the reform needs to come from the bottom up. And in particular, when it comes to the issue of adaptation and loss and damage, I have been working with many other partners, many of them on this call, on this webinar right now, on promoting what we call locally led adaptation, and also now segueing from just locally led adaptation to locally addressing loss and damage at the same time, because the two are now the same thing. They are just one phase. Adaptation minimizes loss and damage, and then once you get the impacts of climate change, you have to address loss and damage. You have to do it all in one swoop. These are not separate things anymore. They're one thing. And to me, to my mind, if we can get the elements in the technical paper that highlight those as solutions, I want to reiterate the focus on solutions rather than agreements. Agreements don't give solutions, unfortunately. We focus all our attention on agreements, which they don't then implement. We need to focus our attention on solutions with coalitions of the willing, both governments and non-governmental actors, and make sure that we are doing things to solve problems in reality and not just focusing on getting global agreements, which we have been doing for a long time and have proven largely. We've had some successes, but not enough. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that, Salim. You raised some important points. The elephant in the room, the two hottest in the world ever, the week that we're not. I was listening to a BBC documentary yesterday that was talking about the ability of the human body to survive in a combination of heat and humidity. And what I'm saying is that some of the things are already happening on a regular basis, where can't survive in those sort of attempts. The important point you
I think we lost Kaveh.
Apologies, I'm back.
Oh, yes.
I'm back. Sorry. And there's serious market failures there in terms of getting the trillions to shift for adaptation, loss and damage. So without further ado, and before I cut out again, I'm going to head over to Debbie from ECLAC to really talk about, in particular, on the issues such as the global goal on adaptation and what that means and what kind of indicators we need in relation to the GGA to ensure that we're on track and achieving it. Debbie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kaveh. Pleasure to be here with you. Hoping you're all doing well. So yes, I want to talk specifically about the global goal and on adaptation and the specific high-level ask of increasing the climate resilience of the global population by 50% by 2030 and by at least 90% by 2050, recognizing that adaptation action is iterative. And also remembering that the adaptation options we have available today might not be available within the next 3, 5 or more years. So which is why we really need to start thinking also about transformational adaptation. But as Marcia and Salim have also been mentioning, we need to start at the bottom, locally led adaptation. And that means we can't have a global set of adaptation indicators. We can have a perhaps global list that then each different country or municipality or locality can take and adjust to their own specific needs and context. And this also talks to equity and justice, which also need to be at the center of climate action, considering the different needs and the different impacts. But we also need to remember that even though we have a great list of different options that you've highlighted, we also need to remember that these options don't function in isolation. And for the global goal of adaptation to really meet its own objective, we need to keep mitigation in mind, because the efforts of mitigation to reduce emissions are also tied with the levels of adaptation that we will need, and that either adaptation or mitigation options don't function in isolation. They have a relationship with each other, and many times we don't look at those relationships. How, for example, one adaptation option can cause maladaptation for another option, how some mitigation options can increase vulnerability, and so forth. So in this IPCC 6 cycle, in SR 1.5, the special report on global warming at 1.5C, we put the concept out of system transitions, which among other things enables a closer look at the synergies and trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation. I also have a couple slides here I just wanted to show with regards to the term feasibility. And again, trying to get this contextual part, we look at feasibility within 6 dimensions, trying to go beyond the technical and economic part, which can signal that a technology is mature, but not necessarily that that they are, for example, acceptable to certain populations. So I don't know if we could put the slide up, please. But besides technological and economic dimensions, we also have social, cultural, institutional, environmental, and geophysical. And that, well, in the second slide, you'll see a list of indicators, which goes from, for example, socio-cultural acceptance, intergenerational equity. In terms of institutions, we look beyond robustness of institutions, but also, for example, at transparency mechanisms. And that these indicators can change depending on the context, on where you're working at. You know, maybe if you're working on indigenous populations in Central America, you'd include indigenous knowledge or Mayan cosmovision specifically. But the idea of this framework is that it can be molded to specific needs and priorities. That, for example, communities can prioritize what indicators they need and are important for them. And lastly, when you talk about early warning systems, something that caught my eye is that you talk about having by 2030 universal coverage of climate services, which is great, in priority climate sensitive sectors: agriculture and food security, health, disaster risk reduction, energy, and water. But here we also need to remember that some of these places might not have access to basic services and infrastructure like water and electricity. So it's not just putting the early warning system up, but ensuring that they also have these basic services and infrastructure. As, for example, something that AR6 highlights is that systemic vulnerability needs to be addressed. When Marcia mentioned the 3.3 to 3.6 highly vulnerable people worldwide, one of the reasons they're highly vulnerable is because of the systemic vulnerabilities that also need to be addressed, among which we can find poor governance or lack of governance, or income tied to climate, like agriculture. And again, just remembering that equity and justice really cut across through all the actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Hopefully you can hear me well. Again, I apologize to you and the audience for the problems that I've been having with my connection. A really important points that you made there, and I'm hoping that some of the audience will pick up on that in the question and answer function. So please do keep those questions coming in. We have now about 5 questions in total, so please keep those coming in, and we'll go to those questions, including coming back to Debbie in the second round of comments. So I'd like now to go over to Christina Rumbaitis, who's with the UN Foundation. We've been working pretty closely with Christina in terms of trying to identify what potential signals could come out of COP28 in terms of those political signals could really generate some momentum around adaptation, achieving resilience and loss and damage. So one of those signals that has been gaining some attention over the last months is this push by the UN Secretary General on early warning systems, for example. So Christina, I'd like to go over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Kaveh. Thanks. Indeed, I'm going to talk about early warning systems and sort of put in a good word for them. But first, I just want to say it's really difficult to choose amongst these different solution sets that you presented. I almost feel like it's choosing your favorite child. And I think particularly so because we know with adaptation and resilience, as many of the other speakers have highlighted, there's no silver bullets. We need integrated solutions. We need bottom-up solutions. We need to look at transformational systemic change. And that's really hard to sort of single out. However, that being said, this Early Warning for All initiative that was launched by the Secretary General, I think is truly the first ever global adaptation initiative that I've seen in my 20 years of working in this space. It has the ambition of covering everyone on Earth, which I think is important from an equity perspective, starting with those that are most vulnerable, starting with LDCs and SIDS and those where the observation networks aren't even available and aren't where they are in other parts of the world. Moreover, I think it's got a very proven impact, 10-to-1 return on investment. In fact, this was the highest return on investment that we found with the Global Commission on Adaptation a few years ago in the flagship report Adapt Now, which highlights the important return on investment that we do have with taking early adaptation action. And I think it can be a lever for systemic change because climate information services, early warning information can support action in so many different sectors, right? It can provide weather intelligence to farmers who can use that to increase their earnings, reduce their losses and damages. And just an example, in Pakistan, there's early warning systems now for wheat rust, which is a pathogen that affects wheat quite quickly. It needs to be addressed quickly, otherwise it can completely destroy a crop. And now farmers are getting alerts through cell phones and other means, radios and other means to be able to respond quickly to that weather-related pathogen. Can also be very important for health. Just think about heat waves and alerts about oncoming heat waves, what to do and where to go. So I think it can be very catalytic, and we're seeing the costs and complexity of deploying these systems come down with new technologies like satellite-based radar, AI forecasting techniques, and the like. So I think it is a feasible solution. There is an opportunity to leverage different types of capital and private sector investment and capacities. But to be effective, early warning needs to connect to early action. And that's where I think Debbie's point just now is really important. It only translates into impact if you're able to take action, if you have access to the services that you need, if you have access to the resources you need to take precautionary measures or anticipatory measures. And so I think it's important that we don't forget that side of the coin, which too often is sort of put aside for focusing on the more techie bits of early warnings or the upstream bits of early warning. And I think it's important that we embed this this initiative and this focus in as many places as possible. So I think the GST is a perfect amplifier of the call that the Secretary General has made to really say we have big gaps right now in our early warning systems and use of climate information. This needs to be addressed. Equally, Debbie mentioned the global goal on adaptation. I could see this as part of a framework or part of a signal that comes out of the global goal on adaptation to really guide investment and action in the years to come. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Christina. And I take your point about choosing amongst your favorite solutions of problems, but also for highlighting that the early warning for all is perhaps the first truly global proposition, and certainly the Secretary General seems to be pushing that pretty hard. But also the notion that having that resource unlocks action in all sorts of potential sectors, and you highlighted some, such as in relation to agriculture, for example. So last but not least, and we're running a little bit behind schedule, but I'll pick it up again a bit later. I'd like to go over to Jingjing, who's based in Copenhagen. And Jingjing, perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit about the linkages between the work of the independent Global Stocktake and the work that we have been highlighting through our technical work here, and really looking at some aspects of the mandate and the role of the global goal on adaptation in relation to the Global Stocktake. So over to you, Jingjing.
Thank you, Kevin. Hello to everyone. First of all, let me congratulate you on this publication, which just came out at the right timing before the final GST. And thanks for having me here to discuss this topic with all of you. So I'm here today also in my capacity of the co-chair of the Adaptation Working Group under the IGST, which is the independent GST program. So the program was established in 2018 as a consortium of civil society actors working together to support a more robust and inclusive GST. So today I will share some of the perspectives that based on our IGST work, but also on the UNEP's relevant work in general. To begin with, I want to refer to GST's dual mandate on adaptation. So both of assessing collective progress towards the Paris Agreement's long-term goals, including the global goal on adaptation, and informing the update and enhancement of national level actions. So in this sense, GST highly relies on the input from parties and non-party stakeholders to understand the adaptation gaps and the key elements that concerns parties' adaptation needs in different contexts. So I want to mention there that our IGST work so far has mainly focused on GST's first mandate of providing assessment on adaptation progress. For example, we have looked at the non-party stakeholders' adaptation efforts and how GST can take that into consideration. We have also looked into the adequacy and the effectiveness of adaptation on the GST. So now we are working on a policy brief on how the final GST output can best address parties' adaptation gaps. So in this sense, I found this publication is very advanced with those high-level signals. Basically, to fulfill GST's mandate, here I want to echo Christina and Debbie on GGA's discussion that I think GGA could play a useful role here by further conceptualizing its three elements into measurable target. For example, what is considered as adequate or effective for enhancing adaptive capacity or to reduce vulnerability risk, and to stressing resilience for parties. So referring to this, I think those high-level asks under the adaptation chapter in your publication are very well centered around these three elements of the GGA. So I'd like to talk a little bit more on two of them. The first one is the coverage of early warning systems supported by effective risk communication. So I think this is highly relevant given that climate risks are rising as climate change accelerate. According to UNEP Adaptation Gap Report 2022 and the 6th IPCC report, climate risks will intensify with each 10th of degree. So, but the adaptation implementation right now is not keeping up with this impact, just as Salmo reminded us the 3 new temperature record in last week. So I think urgent actions are required to help vulnerable countries and the communities to cope with such impact caused by extreme weather event. However, as also identified in the publication, many challenges such as data infrastructure, technical capacity, as well as institutional arrangement must be addressed. I think here, the critical role that GST can play is to provide clear understanding on the global readiness and the gaps in achieving this goal, together with the key recommendations on how to close the political, technical, and the financial gaps in achieving it. Another point I want to talk a little bit today is increasing the capacity and the resources of developing countries. Again, according to the Adaptation Gap Report 2022, without a step change in support, the accelerating climate risks would further widen the adaptation implementation gap. And to close this gap, international collaboration and development support play an important role. Besides what have been mentioned in the publication, UNEP is currently, for example, supporting 20 projects to develop national adaptation plans globally, and this include effort to define methods and systems to assess and quantify impact, climate risks, and vulnerability. Furthermore, UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center also support parties in documenting and communicating their climate risks and adaptation effort through various programs like ICAT, CBIT, and NDC Action. We have many other practice going on, but I will stop here and discuss this further with others. Thank you. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you so much indeed for that, Jingjing. And the sort of towards the end of your presentation, you were sort of talking about the methods need to measure climate risks and vulnerability. And of course, that also relates to, for example, the sort of global resilience goal that Marcia was mentioning at the top, and that's part of the CGS paper. One of the criticisms of goals like that from technical adaptations experts is how do you measure that? But to rate methods to put operative comment. So the chat, please do keep those coming in. Please also do vote on the poll, which is still live. So we've had here by my friend Klein to the great panel, but ask now that we're moving from the technical to the political part of the global stocktake, what lessons have we learned that could help improve the technical part of the second global stock, at least on the mitigation side, would be that arguably the second global stocktake will be too late to halve global emissions. But in the context of adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage, the second and subsequent stocktakes could be and probably will be very important. So that's a good question there from Richard. So I'm wondering if anybody on the panel would like to take that. I don't actually have incoming videos, so if someone wants to from the panel wants to go ahead and answer that question, please do go ahead. Salim,
I'm happy to go first, and then I see Marcia wants to come in as well. So
perfect.
A great question from Richard, and I think it's a very pertinent one for us to think about, particularly those of us who primarily reside in the technical side of the adaptation issue, the adaptation science and research and findings and lessons, and how do we now translate that into the more political level, both at national level, within governments, within countries, and then across countries, within regions of the world, and then at the global level. And I'll just share a little bit about how we are trying to do it in my part of the world, which is Bangladesh and South Asia. In Bangladesh, we have a very, very strong network of locally led adaptation actors in civil society and in government. We feed into national planning like the National Adaptation Plan. We have our own plan called the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan. And in Bangladesh, the government of Bangladesh takes climate change extremely seriously. In fact, we just published our budget for this year, of which 8% of the national budget is allocated to tackling climate change. I don't think any other country comes anywhere near that. So that is the level of seriousness with which Bangladesh takes this issue and is putting the requisite resources from whatever resources we have of our own into taking this seriously. And then broadening that out in the region, talking to our neighboring countries, Nepal, which is upstream of us with the major rivers, the Ganges and Brahmaputra, with partners like India, particularly West Bengal, where we share a common world's largest mangrove forest, the Sundarbans. There's lots and lots of opportunities for cross-border collaboration on adaptation and learning and sharing. And then another dimension that we do a lot of, and my center does, is we work with universities in the least developed countries. We have a network of universities called the LDC Universities Consortium on Climate Change. Many of the LDCs are in sub-Saharan Africa and some in Asia. We have a very good collaboration. We have a lot of sharing of knowledge, particularly on locally led adaptation, which is what we specialize in. And then at the global level, those of us who have the opportunity to go to the global discussions are able to then bring those lessons from the bottom up to the global level, particularly in the context of both the GST as well as the global goal on adaptation. And we just have to become more effective at doing that and connecting the different actors, the scientists with the politicians, with the negotiators, and with the people with the money. That, I think, is the most important one. The money hasn't been coming. I'll stop there. Go over to Marcia.
Thank you, Salim and Kaveh. Very quickly, only to refer.
Thanks, Salim, and also that point. Go ahead, Marcia.
Sorry, we have a delay. I'm so sorry. Just to complement with 2 points, I fully agree with everything that Salim said. And in reference to how do we translate the adaptation action to impact in people, I do believe there is quite big advancements at the technical level, which also the Race to Resilience campaign is playing that role in the ecosystem of actors on adaptation and resilience, is enhancing its metrics framework to better have a menu of options to translate the many different adaptation action to impacts in people at a quantitative level, but also at a qualitative level. How we increasing the agency, the participation of women, the capacity, or any other variable that is critical for really understanding the quality of that resilience. So I would say there is an opportunity to look forward in the next month and in the next years to actually refine that way of translating impact. And drive convergence and accelerate the use and the implementation of those, because otherwise it's going to be, we're going to maintain separated the actual impact in people. We need to start making it more tangible, more clear, more digestible. And in that similar way, at the macro level, and very much looking forward to look into the inputs of Salim, understanding what is the progress on adaptation, the signals of change, the contribution of non-state actors, and how this fits into system at the city level, at the state and region level, and at the national level, and understanding the macro trends. It's very important for us to better understand how the political process can also be much more effective, realistic, bottom up, but at the same time drive clear signals of align global steps, because otherwise we won't be able to continue to convene and accelerate the actions when it's more needed, or accelerate the finance when it's more needed. So there is this duality of rich bottom-up delivery, informing, but also access to the opportunities, and at the same time, clear global view where we need to be, and driving that both global and local is like a master exercise that we all need to play, I would say.
Thanks so much, Marcia, for that answer, and also to Salim. So we have a question that came in from Swathi Manchinkanti that asks on this question of the intersection between agriculture and biodiversity. Are there examples of incentives being used to allow the two areas to complement each other rather than contradict in the context of adaptation? So I'm wondering whether, Deb, you'd like to take on that answer. And also lots of people have asked to see your slides again, so maybe there's a chance to do that.
Yes, thank you, Kaveh. So if we can put the slides up. So just to respond to this question, I don't directly know about the incentives, but this is one of the slides I wanted to show on the multidimensional feasibility assessment that goes beyond economic and technological. So if we see the 6 columns on the right-hand side in light blue, we also see institutional, social, environmental, and geophysical dimensions. So we can see that in most of the options we have, for example, a high to medium feasibility for economic and technological, but almost across the board at the global level, we have a low feasibility at the institutional level. So that is something to keep in mind, that even though there are technologies that are robust and they are economically feasible, sometimes the institutional aspects hinder the proper feasibility and effectiveness of the different options. In the first column, we see potential feasibility, which is just like a summary and average of the 6 dimensions. And then the next column, synergies with mitigation, is how much do these options actually reduce CO2 emissions? So if we see, for example, forest-based adaptation, we have mediums to highs across the board with a strong synergy with mitigation, the same with agroforestry and biodiversity management and ecosystem connectivity, resilient power systems, energy reliability, green infrastructure, and ecosystem services, for example. So just to name a few. But having a low feasibility does not mean that we should omit the option or not deal with it. It means that we can pinpoint more specifically where the problem is. So if we go to the next slide, please. These are the indicators that were used again at the global level, and as I had explained earlier, these can change depending on the either regional, national, or subnational context. It can change depending on, a specific community. So as I had mentioned, if I'm working in a rural Guatemalan community, I definitely add indigenous knowledge under social cultural. So some of these might be applicable, some might not. And in some cases, which is outside of what an IPCC assessment is, you might want to work directly with the communities and weigh these. What are the dimensions that are important to them? And from there, what are the indicators that are important to them? Do these indicators talk to their needs and perceptions? So so to get back to Swati's question, when we're talking about this, we can get a fuller picture of what is happening with a single option. And as she mentioned, when we talk about just transitions, it's not just about reducing CO2 emissions any which way we can. It's how we deal with people and nature as well. I think many people have, I think all my co-panelists have mentioned putting people at center and justice. So it's not just about, well, let's just put renewable energy because renewable energy is good. And I'm not saying that renewable energy is bad, but it's in the how. So we need to think of the how we are implementing and how we work with the people and how we consider the different ecosystems. And I know that in recent years, we talk a lot about synergies and we need to maximize synergies, but we also need to keep in mind that maximizing synergies does not eliminate any trade-offs that we have. And that trade-offs, if identified, we still need to deal with them and how to reduce them. So just again, keep in mind, good synergies are good, but does not eliminate trade-offs. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We had another question from, who was it here? It was from Dan, I think, that was asking a question, interested in the panelists' thoughts about expanding the investigation, measurement and reporting of health co-benefits with adaptation solutions. Marcia has typed an answer there, but I wonder, Christina, whether you have anything to add on that question of the intersection between health and adaptation, which of course, increasingly, given the nature of the impact, is an important topic. Over to you, Christina.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Dan's suggestion of really looking at the co-benefits and potential trade-offs too is a really important point. But maybe just a more broad point is that health doesn't figure in adaptation plans and strategies as much as you think it might, given the importance and given that this is how, how people live and feel climate change is through health conditions. And it was a bit telling with Marcia's slide where there weren't specific health initiatives. There were two to come, and I really hope those do come, and that we do put a lot of effort into developing those health-related solutions, because there are so many health-related impacts, and we're just not putting the attention and resources into it. Just as an example, having worked in the state of Kerala in India, with the medical research community there, they found all sorts of climate-related health links, including increased premature births during heat waves and high humidity and high temperature, and distress births that then have multiple consequences for both mother and child. In addition to mental health stresses that also are linked to heat. You could go on and spend another hour unpacking all the relationships, but I think that's a really critical area that definitely needs to be elevated as a gap where we need to put more attention and effort. And I'll stop there so we can get more questions in.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, given the importance of that issue on health, I wonder whether, Xingjing, whether you have anything you want to say on that one as well.
Thank you, Kevin. I think this is a very relevant question indeed. And when we talk about adaptation, so actually the first key question we should ask ourselves is adaptation to what? So adaptation measures are designed and implemented according to the context. And in this case, if a certain target group of people are exposed to a certain hazard like heat waves and more we see nowadays, so definitely health issues and related resilience building is very much relevant. And I think when we further design the GGA framework, and this need to be reflected as well through target and indicators.
Thank you, Xingjing. I was really struck by your comment of adaptation to what, but also it reminds me of a comment I heard recently, and I'm not an adaptation expert, this notion that we're not only adapting for today's world, we also need to think about the world that we are moving towards and start developing toward that rather than just the world as it is. As Salim said, the impacts are coming thick and fast, and this is just the beginning. I have a couple of questions in relation to Deborah's slides. So Deborah, you're on notice that I'm going to come to you next. So one is on your first slide in terms of adaptation forest activities as one of the top 4 solutions. Could you give some more information on that slide? Should this have been included in our technical paper? And then the second question to you, Deb, is on your second slide. So the first 2 slides generating a lot of interest. On your second slide, indicators and adaptation, these appear to be rather criteria used in feasibility assessment rather than indicators to measure progress. So I wonder if you'd like to come in on those 2 points.
Yes, thank you, Kaveh, and thank you for the question. So start with the second one, and yes, you are right. Those are the feasibility assessment criteria. However, in some of the workshops of the global goal on adaptation and trying to look at what are the indicators and how M&E should be done, we're looking. some of the conversations we're looking at how these indicators could also be used to measure progress. So not to confuse feasibility indicators with monitoring and evaluation, but just looking at, for example, how is social cultural acceptability being considered, not just at the moment of looking at feasibility, but also how is it considered during the planning and the implementation and afterwards. So more of like some of these elements being constant throughout. And it's highlighted more for the social, cultural, and institutional, as those are usually the ones that don't appear as much during project planning or how it's been done to date. So hope that answers that question. As for the first question on forest-based adaptation, it includes reforestation and afforestation, different measures to reduce the risk of wildfires. And we looked basically at the different linkages with other options within the land and ecosystem system transitions. So as I mentioned earlier, AR6 worked with the concept of system transitions, which tries to break down how institutions usually work vertically, like by specific sectors, and trying to branch out into how recognizing the linkages that one option has with the other. You can't separate forests from water options or from agriculture, even though we have an option called agroecology and another option called agroforestry. There are linkages that go beyond that. So that's something that we were also looking at. What are the different forest options and what are their relationships? So yes, as noted, is like one of the options that has high feasibility across the board and strong synergies. So at least from the conclusions of IPCC, that is one of the options that needs to be implemented more. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and sorry for putting you on the spot there, but I think they were good questions. And we had a question as to whether we can share the slides afterwards. We'll try to do that with registered participants afterwards, so we will try our best with that. So we've got a couple of more questions here. One I'd like to address to Salim's from Tim, who says, we strongly agree with Professor Huck's point that solutions are required rather than agreements. And he asks, how useful are regional risk models? I don't know whether you feel happy to come in with an answer to that, or if anyone else on the panel would like to take that. Salim, would you like to take that?
Sure. So thank you for the question, Tim. I think, the emphasis on taking action from local to national to multinational regionals is something that needs to be invested in more than it has been so far. At the moment, we have global and national, in my view, predominating the emphasis on discussions and research on adaptation. And we need to be better at linking them. And as I said, as climate change impacts become self-evident, the risk modeling becomes extremely important. And let me just share with you an experience I had last week here in London, where I'm still staying for a few more days before I return to Dhaka, Bangladesh. I attended the London Climate Action Week that's been held here, hosted by or organized by the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, for a number of years, and I've been attending it for a number of years. But I can tell you that this year, for the first time, I saw a major breakthrough in emphasis on adaptation and resilience, which I never saw before. It was all mitigation in the past. Everybody was talking about mitigation. But now they are understanding that the impacts of climate change are going to happen. In fact, as I just mentioned, London had the hottest June it ever had. And so it is a realization that climate change impacts are happening. And a particularly important event was organized by and hosted by the insurance industry, particularly the reinsurers, who really do understand the notion. I mean, their models, their risk models are better than the IPCC. They are proprietary models. They know exactly how to measure risk, and they are afraid their models, which depend on spreading risk across the world, particularly the reinsurers who take insurance from all the other hundreds and maybe even thousands of insurance companies. They reinsure with only a handful of reinsurance companies, one of them being Lloyd's of London. The reinsurers are really worried about their business case, because their business case depends on spreading risk across the world, and they can pay off in one part of the world by taking premiums from the other part of the world where nothing happens. But if things start happening all over the world and they have to pay out all over the world, their business goes underwater. And some of the insurance companies are not even offering insurance anymore, particularly for flood insurance in the floodplains. In the UK now, you cannot get insurance for your house from flooding anymore if you live within a floodplain zone. And that zone is actually a zone that is drawn by the company. It's not a publicly available zone. The company draws a line and says, you are on the wrong side of this line and we are not going to give you insurance. So, that's the kind of thing that is happening right now. And we need a lot more of it to be able to deal with it.
Thanks so much for that great answer, Salim, and also the focus on London, which is my hometown and not necessarily one of the places you would think was on top of the list of dealing with climate impacts, but the fact that it is having to deal with them shows how widespread this is, but also highlights how particularly vulnerable countries are facing even more difficulties. So we have a couple of more questions here. Chelsea, who's actually in my team in DC, has asked, it was mentioned that locally led adaptation is important. How can we send signals to and through the Global Stocktake to increase local action and resilience? So we have, of course, this issue that the Global Stocktake is a multilateral collective process, but adaptation is locally specific. So I'd like to go to Christina to maybe answer that, and then maybe Marcia would like to come in and complement that. So Christina first.
We're happy to come in on this, and I know multiple people in this panel have a lot to offer on the locally led issue. I mean, I guess my first point is that we need to create the space within the GST process to get that bottom-up feedback. And this is in part answering to Richard Klein's earlier question on how can the process be improved. We need to provide those channels, which Salim highlighted exist in Bangladesh, but probably don't in other places, for grassroots communities to talk about their experience. And there's all sorts of subjective measures of resilience that should carry weight and should feed into these processes. Do people feel more resilient? Are they getting the support that they need or not? And that should be incorporated into how we evaluate adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation action. And I think that's one way that the process can start to reflect the local realities a bit more, but also should reflect those locally led solutions that are coming up everywhere. And it's not just local solutions, it's locally led solutions that are led from the bottom up, that provide very effective, in many cases, solutions for communities in dealing with multiple climate shocks and stresses. And so I think we have a lot to be learning from those experiences in future GSTs and years to come. But I'll stop there and see if anyone else wants to add on that.
Great, thanks a lot for that, Christina. Marcia, did you want to come in on that point specifically as well?
Maybe to highlight two complementary points. I think Christina covered really well. But this is the opportunity in the Global Stocktake to also bring the non-state actor contributions to the Global Stocktake. And in that sense, make it really evident those solutions implemented at the local level with the co-creation, with the agency, with the decision-making that requires those locally led actions. But at the same time, how I see the connective tissue between the Global Stocktake and the Global Goal and Adaptation is also at the level of the people-centered, and recognizing that adaptation will have to really benefit people, then is already by default how we do that. The solution implementation, the delivery action very much needs to respond to that. And we have to get better at translating those impacts and better measuring tracking, and not having everything perfect now should not be a reason why not to prioritize what needs to be prioritized. No, and that's the balance of expecting the perfect world while more moving forward with the information we have at hand, but prioritizing closing those gaps.
Thanks, Marcia, and especially that important point about not having to get everything perfect the first time round, because of course, on the issue of mitigation, and particularly developed countries, when they took the original lead on that under the Kyoto Protocol, they didn't know how to get things right, and that took decades of practice to get to the stage where we are now. And of course, no need to expect that countries, particularly developing or the most vulnerable, would get things absolutely right from the beginning. So I think that's an important point. We have about 10 or so minutes left. I'd like to offer Jingjing a chance to come in, and also maybe Juliana to have a word before we close. We had a question here from Catalina on the impact that climate change can have on loss of culture, particularly when local communities are displaced, and questions about how local knowledge and culture can be part of this conversation about adaptation and resilience. I don't know if anyone wants to come in on that from the panel, but Jingjing, did you have anything you wanted to add before we close?
Yes, I just want to, I've been enjoying this discussion really a lot, and I want to say that assessing and communicating climate risks and to understand how our society is coping with that is very challenging, and that requires both scientific knowledge, but also strong political will. So, and I also want to emphasize that GST itself is not the answer to everything that related to climate change, and we need to have a realistic expectation about GST. But the difficulty part here for the first GST is exactly how to translate those output into actions. And so far, it seems the first GST will be a learning by doing process. I am sure that most of you agree with me, and accepting this limitation can support us to have a more realistic roadmap, I would say. But I believe the technical findings from many of these discussions, including your publication and today's discussion, can provide some potential directions for GST and for the future GST to consider. I think I just want to share this with you. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jingjing. Again, you picked up on a theme made by Marcia, but also a while back by Richard, this notion of learning by doing and how we can improve from the experience of this global stocktake and also leading into the next one. I'd like to ask perhaps Deb to take Catalina's question on the loss of culture, and then maybe turn to Juliana to answer Gerrit's question about nature restoration. So Deb, did you have anything you might want to say on Catalina's question?
Yes, thank you. I think something to turn to this is the values assessment of IPBES, showing also the non-monetary values, because I think a lot of studies tend to focus on monetary and financial indicators. And this is one example of non-monetary that, for example, again, IPBES through transformative change and nexus assessments are also looking into, what can't be quantified, but it also highlights the importance of including indigenous local knowledge and peoples within the different options and responses. And that is an integral part of locally led adaptation or community based. So when we're talking about that, I think indigenous knowledge and culture is just an integral part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We had a comment here from Suzanne on Marcia's point on working with the imperfect resonates with the great work that the Adaptation Research Alliance has been doing. So thanks for that comment, Suzanne. Juliana, I'd like to give you a chance to come in and maybe talk about this point that Gerrit's raised on the question of highlighting nature restoration and forest protection, because I know this is an area that you and Transformer in particular have done some thinking about. Juliana, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you for that question, Gerrit. And if you see the paper, you will see that both in mitigation and adaptation section, we have nature as a core component, and the focus on the mitigation section is precisely on deforestation, restoration, and forest protection. And then we have on adaptation a broader approach to nature, very aligned with the Kunming-Montreal framework in terms of not only halting and reversing biodiversity and ecosystem loss and degradation, but also putting nature on a path to recovery. And there we have included elements such as expanding the support for ecosystem stewardship by indigenous peoples and local communities, nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches as adaptation options for different types of ecosystems, restoration of degraded land, inland water, conserving and managing areas of particular importance. So I would like to say that here we wanted to be very aligned and articulated with the particular targets that were adopted in December by this new framework under the CBD. And we certainly think that with the Global Stocktake, we have an opportunity of going beyond just calling for the integration of these agendas. That of course, there are many ways that you can do that integration. For example, incorporating elements of the biodiversity agenda in the NDCs, or vice versa in the MBSAPs, including your mitigation or adaptation targets. But we believe that by including very punctual targets that were also part of the conversations of the CBD and part of the agreements of parties in there, we will be promoting directly mitigation and adaptation action in this framework. So we welcome any new ideas and any as perhaps just as some final remarks from my side, Kaveh. I think this has been very rich conversation. There are many ideas. I think we have heard a lot on the local nature of adaptation and the importance of the GST reflecting that, the needs and the challenges in terms of monitoring and evaluation, but also the interest in particular solutions such as on nature or early warning systems, or those related to food systems and health, for example. That is one that we don't have now in our paper. So I think that the challenge now is to, and I know it's very difficult, Christina pointed out very well, it's difficult to choose between your children, like which one should go first. But I think that that's the challenge now, to narrow down, to prioritize, and to see in what terms we need to frame all these solutions. But I think that what is very clear for all the interventions that I have heard is that we need to act now. And even if we won't have the perfect information on adaptation or on loss and damage, and even though we still have a lot of challenges in terms of means of implementation, we need to give very concrete signals on what can be done now, even if we cannot cover all sectors, even if we cannot cover all stakeholders, but start with something and continue improving that work. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliana. I mean, I think you reinforced what Marcia said earlier, that even though it's hard to choose between favorite children in this year, particularly of the coincidence of work on biodiversity and also climate, that this area of nature-based solutions is only gaining in importance. But also you highlighted the importance of delivering some clear signals on the way forward. And I think that also echoes comments made by other panelists, that we don't necessarily need to do everything and get everything right at this stage, but we do need to send some clear signals from the COP and focusing on the most transformative. So with that, I'm going to share the results of the poll. I'm hoping that you are able to see that on the screen. If not, please do tell me, because I can't see the incoming video, unfortunately. But I think what the poll shows, as far as I can tell, is that that the audience finds it difficult to choose between the children as well. So I don't see a very clear signal that one or other of the solutions are way ahead of the others. The biodiversity one does seem to be pretty popular, but so does the loss and damage solution relating to helping the most vulnerable to minimize and address loss and damage. So we'll have a look at those results. I would also like to say that we will be contacting all registered participants after this webinar with a link to the video. And in that, we will also send an email address where you can request slides to be shared. So I'm just need to check with panelists that they're happy with us to share slides. So if you want those, please do let us know via that email that we're going to send to you if you want us to share those with you. So with that, it remains for me to say is to really sincerely thank our panelists for joining us from all around the world. They've taken time out of busy schedules. I suspect some of them have taken time out from vacation. I would also like to thank the audience for participating and really asking some excellent questions. I think we actually had more questions and interaction than we have for any of the other convenings, which shows perhaps in a non-scientific way how important this issue of adaptation, achieving resilience, and also loss and damage is, and that is only going to increase in importance, as highlighted by Salim and others. And I would also like to sincerely apologize for some of the technical difficulties that we've had with my internet, but I'm traveling at the moment, so apologies for that. But I think most importantly, you heard from the panel, and they're the most important to hear from. And finally, I'd like to thank very much Juliana, Transformer, also EDF for the work they've done with C2S, and also in particular, Jennifer, who organized all of these convenings, and Philip. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone. And again, finally, to thank the audience. And we will be posting online a recording of this webinar for you to share with people who missed it and your colleagues. So thank you very much indeed. And hopefully see some of you at COP28. Thank you.